Before I go into detail about the background and lead up to the Bear River Massacre, I want to show you the battlefield and kind of go over the general order of things. So at about 3 a.m., Patrick, Connor, Coit, and Major McGarry all headed up from the town of Franklin at a breakneck speed. They'd been going from Salt Lake City, which began on the 22nd, all the way up here to the 29th, and in the process, they had lost about half of their troops to frostbite. They were out for the count, and the remainder of the troops were very angry, and they blamed this horrible living condition not on their officers, but on the Indians in the camp. So Connor immediately began to assemble his men at around 6 a.m. on this ridge, and Chief Sagwitch walked out of his tent and remarked, "I see a cloud of steam on that ridge. Might be the soldiers those boys were talking about." So Connor assembles his troops, and they're all itching for a fight, and immediately there has already been a couple of deaths, so some of the braves in the camp began to assemble, get on their horses, buck their horses back, and beat their chests and brandish their arrows. So the volunteers from California, they're all gold miners, and they know their mission out here, they think, is just to kill Indians. So they begin a full frontal charge, which is ordered by Patrick Connor from that ridge right there. Every last one of them got wet. They fell into the ice, and all of the warriors know they're there. And immediately, they fall through the river. Connor, they say he's a great leader. He didn't even take into account that there was a frozen river right there. And you're leading dozens of infantry across the river on horseback. A lot of them were cavalry, and they broke right through. And historians now believe that the majority of the 14 immediate deaths that were caused at this battle were probably because they fell through the ice or were shot by the warriors that were trying desperately to defend their village. So Connor retreats his men back up to the top of that hill and orders Captain Hoyt and Major McGarry to flank around to this side. Now, the actual location of the Indian camp would have been kind of hugging this ridgeline right here, but Connor did this so that when he and his men, the majority of them, charged from the ridge behind me, they wouldn't be able to escape up over that ridgeline. And he told McGarry to wait for his order before charging down. So McGarry gets his troops together and lines them up, but he is notoriously short-tempered. So while Sagwitch is saying, please just exercise caution, they probably are just here to arrest the men responsible for the murder, the braves and the warriors are already doing their war dances and their war cries, and McGarry orders a charge. And it's estimated because McGarry disobeyed his orders from his superior commander by ordering this charge, and it's estimated that the majority of the 40-something men who were injured on the U.S. side and the 15 men who died were probably in this initial charge. Now Connor sees this happening and he says, you know, damn it. So he orders a charge, and his troops go into the camp, and there's about 75 homes there. They begin burning them down, stealing the Native American horses, and killing everybody they see. But before Connor could even properly assemble his men, McGarry wanted to fight. He wanted that glory for himself. Everybody here desperately wanted to make a name for themselves as fighting men, so McGarry charged his men down into the village from behind and began the attack. And Connor, from this hill up here, saw it and figured, I better charge too. And the killing field was right here. They killed hundreds of people. I've heard 250, I've heard 300 to 400. It's totally unknown. But the killing that commenced was a total massacre. In fact, soldiers who survived this battle said that no order was needed or heeded. And basically they tried issuing some orders, but they just spread out through the camp and began slaughtering people in their teepees, men, women, and children. Now, when Brigham Young arrived in 1847, he had a theology which said that the Indians were the tribe of laymen, and although they were savages, he had a policy of feed them, do not fight them. In fact, he sent up James Doty in the 1850s and 60s to this valley, and James Doty was the superintendent of Indian Affairs and would later become the governor of Utah after the Bear River Massacre, and this is what led to peace with Chief Sagwitch. And when Doty came up here, he found the Indians starving because this valley had been fenced off. They no longer were able to use it for hunting for elk and buffalo and deer, and they had resorted to catching fish, but that was just not enough to feed the hundreds of people living here. And he remarked that they'd taken to attacking the overland mail route. Now, eventually in 1862, two important incidents happened. One, a local white settler had lost his horse, and another man in that community went up to Summit Creek and found a boy fishing. Now the boy immediately said, you know, here, I found some fish, would you like to help yourself? And he imprisons this boy and takes him down to town, and even though the owner of the horse, which is now lost, said, he didn't do it, I know this kid, he's a good guy, the town decides to hang him. So immediately, they've killed the chief's son. Now in 1862, gold was also discovered in southwestern Montana, and the path to go from Salt Lake City to southwestern Montana just so happens to come through this valley where all these starving Native Americans are living. Because they were all starving and because there was very little food left and it was freezing and it was a very tough winter, they held a warm dance. So hundreds of Native Americans gathered to pray for warmer weather. And a miner that was passing down from the grasshopper mines up in Montana down to Salt Lake was approached by a group of Native Americans who had broken off from this warm dance, and they killed him. Well, people who saw this happen went down to Salt Lake and they issued a warrant for the arrest of 3 chiefs. That would be Sandpitch, Sagwitch, and Bear Hunter. Now these were 3 head chiefs of the Shoshone here who were kind of in charge of the war dance. And because this warrant was issued, they tasked the US Marshals with doing it. But the marshal, who was supposed to do it, said there's no way I'm going to be able to walk into this camp, they'll kill me. So we took it to Patrick Connor, who was that colonel seeking glory in the Civil War. So Connor immediately made it known that he did not intend to take any prisoners, so on the 24th of January 1863 gathers 275 cavalrymen and starts the march north. Now, Patrick Connor, he has formed the 3rd California Volunteers. These are probably the most brutal standing army that could possibly be formed at that point in time, because he formed them from people that were gold miners and desperados in California, and until that point, they'd only hunted down outlaw Mexicans. So they were itching for a fight, and they were mostly the sort of Wild West desperados that you could expect from California. They weren't standing men like a standing army. So they come in and they also want to fight in Virginia. They don't want to be here in Utah in winter. They want to go fight in the Civil War for glory and for the Union, right? So now they're tasked with preventing people from clipping the telegraph wires and watching for sage fires. So they're immediately pissed, but they're given this order to go enforce the warrant. And they immediately see it as an opportunity to begin a massacre. I'm standing now in ground zero for the actual massacre itself. Over here you can see steam rising from a hot spring, which is actually where Sagwitch might have taken his survivors after the massacre. This is the hill that the attack began from as Major McGary's troops traveled down. And right here is the old monument to the massacre. In fact, the monument here by Daughters of Utah Pioneers mischaracterizes it as a battle. And this is the ridge that Patrick Connor and his troops launched the initial assault from. And they tried assaulting, but they fell through the river and 14 died pretty immediately from that. And immediately following that is McGary's charge and the massacre proper. In fact, probably right near me now is where they tortured Bear Hunter to death by branding him all over his body with a red-hot bayonet before driving it through both of his eyes and then his forehead. And it seems that at some point, Sagwitch escaped. 2 of the horses that he was trying to ride out were shot right out from underneath him, but he managed to escape. At least 2 of his children and his wife were lost, and one of his children, who was only 2 years old, was shot 7 times and would later go on to be given to a Mormon family, and he would become a bishop, and actually a quite famous bishop, but they gave him a white name. So basically Bear Hunter died, Sagwitch escaped, and also Sandpitch escaped, and Sandpitch would later surface in the Black Hawk War because his son was Chief Black Hawk, and in 1867 when he rode up to the Mormons trying to say, I'll negotiate for an end to the war, I mean, he's my son, I can stop him, the Mormons imprisoned him, and a year later he escaped and they shot him in Manti Canyon. So the only one to survive to old age was Chief Sagwitch. Now, there are an interesting number of dynamics here. Because Patrick Edward Connor hated the Mormons vehemently and wanted to start a rebellion, he did not supply any of the survivors. There were about 160 survivors and 250 dead. Didn't give them any food, so the only place that those Native Americans felt they could turn was the LDS Church. So Sagwitch led his band, after a while of starving to death and dying out in the cold with no structures to even keep them out of the wind, he raided the area around here for food for a while, and then he went to the church who gave him protection, and he led his people to be baptized. In fact, Governor James Doty actually sought out Sagwitch to basically negotiate an end to the raiding because they knew Patrick Connor and the military wouldn't do anything. So Doty actually tried to extend the olive branch, and Sagwitch realized that the way to survive was to join up with the LDS Church, and he actually became a celebrated figure in the LDS Church. And the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone, they own the battlefield behind me, and they've been slowly acquiring more parcels of land which the battle took place in. And it was an incredibly sad moment for basically all of Wild West history. Even the U.S. cavalry, even the survivors of it, remarked that it was a brutal massacre, and they looked back on it in horror, wondering how they could have done those things. The cemetery where Chief Sagwitch is buried is now overgrown. It's kind of late in the year, late in August, but if you pan around you can see a couple of the graves sticking out. I don't think anybody's been here to maintain this over the last few months, and pretty soon it'll be winter, which is the last time I came here. I think I still have some videos of Sagwitch's grave, which I'll try to splice in, but you can see here it's at the southern edge of the valley, which is their historic homeland, or a small part of it. I've read that for years all the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone had was the cemetery, and that's behind me, and that they then bought the Bear River Massacre battlefield, but there are a few people who still live on this reservation. This house in front of me is a man I interviewed a couple of years ago, back before I kind of understood a little bit more about the Bear River Massacre, and there is a house that's just down the road from him that his father used to live in. When I visited last, he said that he was the last man on the reservation, but it seems that there are a few people here as well, but I don't know if it is occupied year-round because it looks partly abandoned. Very few homes are still here in Washakie. It's mostly a ghost town. The man I spoke to last time, he said that really they were kind of dissatisfied with the LDS Church, and this is the temple that was in Washakie. The local area has quite a few Native Americans living here, or at least visiting fairly often. And as you pan over here, you can see most of the areas where they live are just a little bit north of me. And this is the chemical factory that's kind of taken over. They've got a little gas pipeline. And the reason why there was dissatisfaction with the LDS Church is because even though they weren't the ones that were committing the massacre, a lot of people still feel that their people only turned over to the LDS Church out of kind of a sense of desperation after the massacre happened, because the army wasn't feeding them, the military, the government, territorial government wasn't feeding them, so a lot of them had to turn to the LDS Church, and it kind of stayed that way for many, many years. And to this day, most people in the Northwestern Shoshone Reservation, or in the band, are members of the church. And this is the view down into Cache Valley now as you come up over this hill. It's actually kind of scary because 5 feet back you have no idea what you're coming up on from the view of inside your car. And here's that monument I was telling you about. It characterizes it as attacks by the Indians on the peaceful settlers of the valley, which is definitely a mischaracterization. And you can see offerings left by Native Americans. The Northwest Band of the Shoshone lives in the town of Washakie, but I believe there's only a couple of them on that reservation. It's not really classed as a reservation at all. They lived there for years after the massacre, but basically all moved out. You have a row of 3 monuments here which are very important to the Bear River Massacre's history. Over to the left you have the grave of Patrick Edward Connor, who's chiefly responsible for the massacre. Over here you have a monument to the 3rd California Volunteers who died in the Bear River Massacre. And I do feel badly for a lot of these guys because many of them were just European immigrants seeking citizenship, so they volunteered for something that they didn't know would go south so quickly. And over here you have the grave of James Doty, who was the federally appointed governor of Utah. And it was Doty's efforts that helped negotiate an end with Chief Sagwitch, because after the massacre he was forced to raid northern Utah to feed his people. Then he brought him to the negotiating table saying, you know, the government of Utah is kind of a little bit separate from the military government, and we don't want to be seen as the bad guys because it was mainly a massacre that fell on the shoulders of Patrick Connor. It need also be pointed out that the reason why the Bear River Massacre went south so quickly is that the majority of Connor's troops were of the 3rd California Volunteers, a unit that he created. And the 3rd California Volunteers drew upon the large mining community. All of these guys were crazy mountain men, prospectors that went to the California Gold Rush, and they were naturally not treated very well once they got here, and they didn't treat the locals well. And they were also very annoyed, and Connor, in all respects, kind of treated them poorly. In fact, a lot of their graves are the ones that are unknown. People don't know who they are. But around me rests the graves of the 15 people who died immediately after the the massacre at Bear River, and then other people who died of their injuries weeks and months later.